Everything you've been told about losing belly fat after menopause is based on a model that was never designed for your body. That calorie deficit that worked at 35, it's now triggering the exact hormonal cascade that's making your midsection expand. There is a moment that almost every woman remembers. Not a dramatic event, not a diagnosis, not a conversation with a specialist or a number on a lab report. Just a quiet morning, standing in front of the mirror, pulling at the waistband of pants that fit 3 months ago, and feeling something shift inside. Not just the body, something deeper, something that touches the core of who you believe yourself to be. A loss of recognition. The woman in the reflection still has the same face, the same eyes, the same hands that have carried groceries and signed permission slips and held other people together for decades. But the midsection, that soft, stubborn, seemingly immovable layer that appeared without invitation and settled in without permission, feels like it belongs to someone else entirely. And the most disorienting part is not that it showed up. It is that nothing you do seems to make it leave. And what makes it truly devastating is not the weight itself. It is the silence around it, the lack of honest answers. The sheer absence of anyone sitting down and saying, "This is what is actually happening in your body, and this is why everything you have tried has not worked." Instead, what women receive is recycled advice from people who have never lived inside a body, rewriting its own hormonal blueprint overnight. Eat less. Move more. Try intermittent fasting. Cut the carbs. Have you considered stress? These phrases land like stones in the chest of a woman who has already done all of those things. Sometimes all at once, sometimes with desperate precision, and watch the scale either freeze in place or, more cruelly, climb higher. She starts to wonder if something is fundamentally wrong with her, if she has lost the ability to control her own body, if this is just what aging looks like, and she should accept it. This is where the frustration becomes something more than frustration. It becomes grief. Because what no one explains, what almost no one takes the time to sit down and say clearly, is that the belly fat that appears during and after menopause is not the same fat you carried at 25 or 30. It is not the same tissue. It does not respond to the same signals. It does not obey the same rules. And until you understand what it actually is, every strategy you throw at it will feel like screaming into a wall. So let us start where the science starts. Not with diets or exercise routines, but with what is actually happening beneath the skin. When estrogen levels begin to decline, and this process can start years before your final period, sometimes as early as your late 30s, deep in the landscape of perimenopause, the body initiates a quiet but profound reorganization of where and how it stores fat. This is not a gradual dimming. It is a seismic shift that most women are never warned about. For most of a woman's reproductive life, estrogen acts as a kind of traffic controller for fat metabolism. It directs fat storage primarily to the hips, thighs, and buttocks. Subcutaneous fat, the kind that sits just beneath the skin. This fat is metabolically relatively stable. It does not aggressively interfere with your organs. It actually has a protective function, serving as an energy reserve and even producing some beneficial hormones. Estrogen essentially tells the body, store it here, keep the midsection lean, protect the vital organs. But when estrogen falls, and it does not fall gracefully, it plummets and surges and crashes in unpredictable waves that can change week to week. That traffic controller leaves the building. And the body, suddenly without its primary fat distribution signal, begins rerouting storage with ruthless efficiency. Fat starts accumulating not under the skin where you can pinch it, but deep in the abdominal cavity, wrapping around the organs, liver, intestines, pancreas, kidneys. This is visceral fat, and it is a fundamentally different substance than the fat you have known your entire adult life. It looks different under a scan. It behaves differently in the bloodstream, and it responds to entirely different signals than the subcutaneous fat that diet culture has spent decades teaching you to fight. Visceral fat is metabolically active. It behaves almost like an endocrine organ of its own, secreting inflammatory molecules, disrupting insulin signaling, and creating a biochemical environment that makes further fat storage even easier. It is not passive. It is not just sitting there. It is actively communicating with your liver, your pancreas, your immune system. And one of its loudest messages is, store more. Hold on to everything. Do not release. This is why calorie restriction alone fails so spectacularly for women in menopause. When you dramatically cut calories, your body, already in a state of hormonal alarm, interprets the deficit as a threat. Cortisol rises. Cortisol, the stress hormone, has a specific and well-documented relationship with abdominal fat. It tells the body to store visceral fat preferentially. So the very act of aggressive dieting, in a body already stripped of its estrogen buffer, can accelerate the exact problem you are trying to solve. This is not a failure of willpower. This is endocrinology. This is your body responding to signals you did not choose and cannot override with sheer determination. And here is where the picture gets even more layered, even more frustrating for women who feel like they are doing everything right. Because cortisol does not work alone. Insulin, the hormone that regulates blood sugar and determines whether your body stores or burns energy, becomes significantly less efficient during menopause. Research published in the journal Diabetes Care has shown that the menopausal transition is independently associated with increased insulin resistance, regardless of age or body weight. This is crucial. It means the change is hormonal, not behavioral. What this means in practical terms is devastating and simple. Your body becomes measurably worse at processing the same foods it handled effortlessly a decade ago. The same bowl of oatmeal, the same piece of fruit, the same portion of rice, the same glass of wine with dinner. The glucose response changes, sometimes dramatically, because the hormonal environment has changed. And no one warned you this would happen. When insulin stays elevated, because the cells are not responding to it as quickly, the body remains in storage mode. Fat is locked inside cells. Energy is diverted into reserves rather than being burned. And the midsection, now the body's preferred storage location, expands. This creates a loop. Visceral fat increases inflammation. Inflammation worsens insulin resistance. Insulin resistance promotes more fat storage. More fat storage increases cortisol. Cortisol promotes more visceral fat. The cycle feeds itself, and no amount of willpower alone can break it, because willpower is not a hormone. I have worked with women for years in clinical practice, and one of the most painful conversations I have had, over and over, is with women who arrive already broken. Not physically, emotionally. They have been told, by well-meaning professionals, by the internet, by their own internal critic, that they simply are not trying hard enough. That if they just found the right diet, the right workout, the right supplement, the belly would disappear. One woman stays with me vividly. Colleen, 53 years old. A landscape architect who spent her days on her feet, measuring slopes, hauling soil samples, walking job sites in sun and rain, designing outdoor spaces that made other people feel alive. She had recently become an empty nester. Her youngest had left for college 2 months earlier, and the house echoed with a silence she was not yet ready to name. The dog followed her from room to room, as if sensing something had changed. She came to see a specialist not because of the weight. She came because of the exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that sleep does not fix, that coffee barely touches, that sits behind the eyes like a permanent fog. She was sleeping 5 hours a night, waking drenched in sweat at 3 a.m, heart hammering for no reason. And by 2 p.m, her brain felt like it was operating through wet cotton. Words disappeared mid-sentence. Her creativity, the thing that defined her career, felt like it had been packed into a box and stored in a room she could no longer find. The weight, she said, was just the visible part of something invisible, the part other people could see. But the real devastation was everything they could not. And she was right. When her full hormonal panel came back, not just the standard thyroid check, but a comprehensive look at estradiol, progesterone, fasting insulin, HOMA-IR, cortisol rhythm, DHEAS, and inflammatory markers, the picture was stunningly clear. Her estradiol had dropped to postmenopausal levels, even though she was still having occasional periods. Her fasting insulin was elevated. Her cortisol pattern was flattened, high at night, low in the morning. The exact inverse of what a healthy pattern looks like. Her body was not broken. It was responding perfectly to a hormonal environment that no one had bothered to actually measure. This is the gap. The enormous, echoing gap in how women's health is handled during this transition. The default approach? Eat less, exercise more, maybe take an antidepressant, ignores the endocrine reality of what is happening. And when the approach fails, the woman is blamed. She is told she is not consistent, not disciplined, not committed. There is a different way to approach this, and the science supporting it has grown enormously in the last decade. First, strength training. And I need to be specific here, because this is one of the most misunderstood recommendations in women's health. Not gentle yoga, not long, slow cardio on the elliptical. The kind of exercise that many women default to because they were told in the 90s that cardio burns fat. Resistance training, lifting weights heavy enough to challenge the muscles toward actual fatigue, has been shown in multiple rigorous studies to improve insulin sensitivity independently of weight loss. This is an extraordinary finding. A study published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism found that postmenopausal women who engaged in progressive resistance training showed significant reductions in visceral fat, even when total body weight on the scale remained completely stable. The number did not change. The composition did. The muscle becomes a metabolic engine. It pulls glucose out of the blood without requiring as much insulin. It increases resting metabolic rate. It reshapes the hormonal conversation in ways that no amount of treadmill time can replicate. Second, sleep. And I do not mean the dismissive, try to get more rest that women hear constantly. Sleep architecture changes during menopause, partially due to hot flashes, partially due to shifting progesterone, partially due to cortisol patterns. But sleep deprivation is one of the single most powerful drivers of visceral fat accumulation. A landmark study from the University of Chicago demonstrated that just 4 nights of poor sleep increased insulin resistance by 30% in otherwise healthy individuals. 30% in 4 nights. Addressing sleep is not a luxury during menopause. It is a metabolic intervention. Third, the composition and timing of food matters far more than the quantity. And this is where the old model falls apart most visibly. The outdated framework of calories in, calories out was built on metabolic studies of young men in controlled environments. It was never designed for a 53-year-old woman whose hormonal orchestra has changed conductors mid-symphony. What matters now, what the research increasingly supports, is glycemic impact, protein adequacy, fiber density, and meal timing relative to circadian rhythm. Ensuring sufficient protein, research suggests at least 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight daily for menopausal women, and some studies suggest even higher, helps preserve the muscle mass that is already declining due to hormonal changes, which in turn supports insulin sensitivity and metabolic rate. Pairing carbohydrates with protein and healthy fats blunts the glucose spikes that drive insulin surges and promote visceral storage. Eating the largest meal earlier in the day, when insulin sensitivity is naturally at its peak, aligns with the body's circadian biology, rather than fighting against it. These are not minor adjustments. For some women, restructuring meal composition and timing without changing the total amount of food produces measurable changes in waist circumference within weeks. I want to pause here for a moment and be transparent about something. Because there is a layer beneath the science that matters just as much, and it rarely gets discussed. Menopause belly fat is not just a metabolic event. It is an identity event. For many women, the midsection is where the loss is most visible, most public, most impossible to hide. And in a culture that equates thinness with worth, especially for women, the appearance of belly fat during an already vulnerable life transition carries emotional weight that no clinical study can fully capture. The grief is real. The frustration is real. The feeling of being abandoned by your own biology, that is real. And no responsible specialist should dismiss that or reduce it to a simple matter of macronutrient ratios. What I have seen transform women's relationship with their bodies during this phase is not a single intervention. It is understanding. Understanding that this is not a failure, that their body is not broken, that the fat is not a punishment for something they did or did not do. It is a biological response to a hormonal transition that every woman's body navigates, and the body can be supported through it, not punished into submission, but genuinely supported. If you have been searching for answers and feel like nothing has worked, I want you to know that there is information that can genuinely shift how you understand what is happening inside your body right now. I have put together something that goes much deeper than what we can cover here. It is available through the first link in the description below. No gimmicks, just science made accessible and personal. Fourth, and this is often the most overlooked piece, stress physiology. The adrenal glands, which produce cortisol, do not exist in isolation. They are part of a deeply interconnected system that responds to psychological stress, sleep deprivation, blood sugar instability, and even gut inflammation. For women in menopause, the adrenals are also attempting to produce small amounts of estrogen to partially compensate for ovarian decline. When chronic stress keeps cortisol demand high, the adrenals prioritize survival hormones over compensatory sex hormones. The result is a woman who feels simultaneously wired and exhausted, whose belly continues to expand despite genuine effort, and whose emotional resilience feels paper-thin. Addressing this is not about downloading a meditation app and hoping for the best, though mindfulness practice does have legitimate clinical evidence behind it. It is about understanding that the nervous system, a system that has been running in a state of low-grade alarm for months or years, needs deliberate, consistent downregulation. Breathing techniques that activate the vagus nerve and shift the body from sympathetic to parasympathetic dominance. Walking in nature, shown in multiple studies to reduce cortisol more effectively than indoor exercise of the same intensity and duration. Reducing exposure to inflammatory triggers in the diet, including processed seed oils, excessive sugar, and food sensitivities that may have developed as gut permeability changed during hormonal shifts. Supporting the gut microbiome, which communicates directly with the brain through the vagus nerve and influences both systemic inflammation and mood regulation in ways that science is only beginning to fully map. The gut-brain hormone axis is not a fringe concept. It is now one of the most active areas of research in menopausal health. Colleen's story did not end in that first appointment. Over the following months, with proper hormonal support guided by her lab results, a structured strength training program she initially resisted, she told me she had not picked up a dumbbell since her 20s and was convinced she would hurt herself. Deliberate sleep hygiene protocols that addressed both her night sweats and her cortisol rhythm, and a nutritional approach that focused on nourishment rather than restriction, on feeding the body rather than starving the problem. Her body began to change. Not dramatically at first, not overnight, not in the way that social media promises transformation in 30 days. The scale moved slowly, and there were weeks it did not move at all. But the visceral fat measurements on her follow-up scans decreased significantly. Her fasting insulin normalized. Her cortisol rhythm began to correct. Morning levels rising, nighttime levels dropping back to where they belonged. Her sleep deepened, the brain fog lifted, and perhaps most importantly, her energy returned. Not the anxious, caffeine-driven energy of someone pushing through, but the genuine, sustained vitality of a body that is no longer in crisis. She told me one afternoon, sitting in the same chair where she had first described feeling like a stranger in her own skin, that she finally felt like herself again. Not the self from 20 years ago. She was not trying to go backward. A new self. One she was learning to know. One she was beginning to trust. This is what the conversation about menopause belly fat so desperately needs. Not another diet plan. Not another workout program promising to blast belly fat in 7 days. But a genuine understanding of the hormonal, metabolic, and emotional architecture that creates this specific challenge, and the evidence-based tools that actually work within that architecture. The research is clear. The solutions exist. They are not magic. They require patience and consistency. But they are real, and they work because they address the actual problem rather than the imaginary one. If any of this resonated with you, if you felt seen for even a moment, I have placed additional resources in the pinned comment below. Something specifically designed for women navigating this exact transition, with the depth and specificity this topic deserves. I would not mention it if I did not genuinely believe it could help. Because here is the truth that no one says loudly enough. You were never failing. The approach was failing you. Your body was never the problem. The understanding of your body was the problem. And when you finally have the right information, when someone finally explains the full picture rather than handing you another calorie chart, everything changes. Not because you suddenly become disciplined enough, but because you finally know what you are actually dealing with. And that knowledge is not a small thing. For a woman standing in front of a mirror, pulling at a waistband, searching for answers, that knowledge is everything.